Hey everybody, this is Troy Brownfield for Graphic Policies Super Articulate. Hope you're doing well. I wanted to start off this time by taking a look at the cover of a very particular comic before we get into it. Obviously, this is Justice League of America number 200 from the original series. It happens to be my favorite single issue of a comic of all time. You should dig into the history of that if you're curious, but that cover and about 48 of the 72 pages on the inside are done by George Perez. And I had the good fortune of first getting to know George a little bit, interviewing him in the late 90s and interviewing him a couple times since. And we both happened to be tabling at the first Indiana Comic Con a few years ago. And I had the opportunity to get George to sign this particular book. So this is a good gateway into the overall conversation, which stems off some of our team completion kind of conversations that we've had lately. But it really has to do with kind of the iconic significance of when you feel like you get a group of characters completed. And for me, one of the things that I'd kind of always wanted to have happen was a complete lineup of this Justice League. And if we'll zoom along over here to superpowers, they made a game effort, but they never quite made it. There was never a Black Canary or an elongated man. So as we take a look back over here, DC Direct really did a great job of trying to capture those Silver Age characters. And when they started off in the 90s, it took a while because they didn't immediately have access to Batman and Superman, thanks to various deals with Mattel and so forth. But it was pretty cool that they eventually realized that sort of complete lineup that was, the big original 7, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, and Martian Manhunter. Although their appearances were different in various scale and so forth because of some inconsistency in the early DC Direct line, some intentional, some not. They did end up putting that group together. And then, as they went along, they did manage to add the rest of the members of the Satellite League, the 15 main characters as they appear in that particular issue. So that was kind of a big moment for me. And not only that, but, we got Metamorpho, Phantom Stranger, Adam Strange, some of the key figures. I also like that DC Direct, despite the fact that I don't think this is the best figure overall, I do like that they did the Zatanna costume from that period. They've never done the original Zatanna costume as a Justice League member, because they've obviously done a lot of variations of the Magician costume that you see in the Zatanna's Quest issues and the trade paperback they made of that. But she wore an intermediate costume before this particular Perez iteration, which was basically a black costume that was just like a black form fitter, sleeveless with a cutout and a cape, and she wore a ponytail in that. And so those early issues where she was a Justice League member, she wore that. I don't believe they've ever made a variation of that particular figure. But this outfit that you see here, she wore in the League for many years, on up into Legends. And I believe it was the one shot after the dissolution of the Justice League where she sort of shifted back to the Magician costume. So it was interesting that you had this kind of effort to complete a lineup. And I remember doing an interview with George Brewer a while back. This is in the early 2000s, during that DC Direct heyday when they were making the Titans. And it was kind of funny because I really got the sense there's some people there that didn't like Jericho as a character at DC Direct. But the fact remains that they did make Jericho. And they did get those original 7 Wolfman Perez Titans and Terra and Jericho. Speedy, Aqualad, and so forth. But they kind of stopped with that group before they got into Titans Hunt with Phantasm, Danny Chase, etc. But they did skip over to, another decent effort with the whole, McCone Johns Titans, and took some swings. But, a good example of teams that didn't really get wrapped up, the outsiders. At least in this iteration, there was never a classic yellow and red suit katana, no halo, no looker. So it was kind of interesting. There was a lot of attention paid to the Justice League in those early DC Direct years. And, you take a look, you've got a pretty solid representation of the Justice League International, which Mary Marvel I put in there because of formerly known as Justice League, but they even went so far as to make the 80s Canary, which I've adjusted so you can see a little bit. Those 80s versions of Fire and Ice, Beetle and Booster, of course. So you did have a pretty significant representation. And then you got into sort of the Morrison JLA, but never all in a way that did, Connor Hawk or Zariel or Aztec, although they did do a Tomorrow Woman, which was kind of an interesting choice. When the DC Universe Classics started, going into this, they did get into the teams in a big way as well. And you really did see again, kind of replication of this effort to get the 15 members of the Satellite League. I don't know about you guys, my Zatanna's hat never wants to stay on, but they really did once again go for the 15 plus Hawkwoman and Phantom Stranger. And I've got Metamorpho on a different shelf on this one for reasons known only to me. And then, Phantom Stranger, of course. And yeah, that screen is the original Game Master screen from the DC role-playing game. Don't judge me. And then, down here, again, you've got the DC Universe Classics representation of their swings at International and various other components. And of course, their kind of awesomely weird all-in swing at completing the Super Friends lineups. Zan, Jaina, Gleek, Samurai, Eldorado, Black Vulcan, Apache Chief, and then Golden Pharaoh from the Super Friends lineup, and also Cyclotron in there. That's just nuts. And then, taking a look at the JSA, this is another decent swing that they made. DC Direct over here really took many aims, and it's kind of funny that when you look, it's once again kind of the same figures that get left out. The Terry Sloan, Mr. Terrific, the Johnny Thunder and the Thunderbolt, Ma Hunkel, Star Spangled Kid. You see the original Sylvester Pimpleton. You see these are the ones that kind of get left out over and over, which is kind of a shame that you never have that full representation. DC Universe Classics did, and you see some DC Multiverse in here too. They really did do a lot with Titans and Young Justice, though, so that's a pretty solid consideration of effort. But it is interesting when you look at it. There's not quite the uniformity of scale and execution over here, but it is pretty neat. But when you get kind of a whole iconic lineup together like that, it's pretty cool. It means something to the collector. It means something to the fan. And, this is pretty much one of those things where we have a group of characters that, in my opinion, is tied to a particular issue as kind of a touchstone. I want to hear from you guys. What are particular comic stories or issues or films that you really feel there's a great iconic representation of the whole lineup, or ones that you feel almost quite made it? And what would you like to see in terms of something, or what is the ultimate lineup for you that's never fully been realized? Give us a shout. We'd love to hear from you. Once again, this is Troy Brownfield for Super Articulate at graphicpolicy.com.